Before here, back today with a video where we are going to talk about Boba Fett, any methods necessary. He is the leader from Jump to Lightspeed. We're going to go over him with a little bit of a deep dive here today. If you have watched the Piet video, this is not quite as big of a deep dive because I don't think that he lends himself to quite as many colors as Piet, but we'll talk about that as we go. First up, contents of this video. We're going to talk about the leader, Boba Fett, any methods necessary. We'll talk about his leader basics, triggering his ability, and then we'll look at some core cards for Cunning, Aggression, Command, and Vigilance. I'm going to give you a couple of decks, including a Boba Cunning deck that I call They're No Good to Me Dead. We'll talk about playing Boba Yellow, Boba Red, Feared Bounty Hunter, and we'll talk about playing Boba Red. Then we will go over some of the matchups, and in here I'm including some of the major meta players. Today is one of the first days of the Bothan Invitational in Atlanta, and that one is going to define part of our meta, as well as a tournament that is happening in Europe today, which is hugely Django. But we'll talk about some of the matchups, what we do in those games, and kind of how we can play into them. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps grow the channel, gives us kind of a interesting bit of reach. Sometime soon coming up in here, we'll go back and we'll do a video recapping what's going on with Saber 4, the channel, and kind of how it's done. And we'd love for you to be a part of it. So hit that subscribe button so that you know when it's coming and when new deck videos are out. All right, Boba Fett. This guy is one of our new leaders and not really a replacement for what we had in Spark of Rebellion. But with his presence, we know that we will have a pretty long-standing option to play Boba Fett even in through that first rotation. We put him in Aggression this time. He is Aggression Villainy. His deploy cost is for 6 resources. The type of ability, and I went over leader abilities in a different video, he is a reactive leader. And so his ability does not allow you to do soft passing if you're talking about trying to slow down actions. His reactive ability is to deal indirect damage following non-combat damage. As a unit, he is a vanilla 4/7. He does not have any kind of action that he takes if he goes to the ground as an individual unit. However, if he becomes a pilot, which is one of the core mechanics of Jump to Lightspeed, he does a barrage for 4 damage divided as you choose, and then he is a 4/4 that comes out there, as we said, on 6 resources. Triggering that Boba ability. When we're talking about core cards, we're going to talk about something that directly triggers the ability of Boba Fett, and those include things like on-attack abilities, direct damage, when played or when defeated abilities, or if you're playing Twin Suns, the blast token. With this leader, you want to think of everything that your opponent plays as effective base health, because indirect damage can be soaked by anything, and until you have a Devastator on the board, that is your opponent's choice where it goes. This does make their unit health pool shrink, and so it's going to make them a little bit more vulnerable to either ping damage from something like IG-88, IG-2000, the barrage damage, the War Juggernaut, or Devastator. But it also allows them to soak damage that could otherwise go to their base. And we do want to maximize what we do with this. Our goal is to activate Boba's ability every single turn that we're available. After the flip, Boba can condense actions if he's a pilot. And by condensing actions, I mean that if you have him on a unit and you swing with that unit, Boba's 4 damage comes in with that swing. If you have him separated and you have him on the ground by himself, then Boba's 4 damage still happens if you get to swing him, but it happens as a separate action. And in the late game, we want to try and action condense in a lot of cases so that we can minimize the amount of actions that it takes between our leader flip turn and when our opponent's base is defeated. And so Boba condenses actions if he is on a ship as a pilot. because he is allowing us to do his 4 damage straight out with one single swing of that vehicle. All right, core cards. In aggression, this is where we're going to start out. We're going to start out with this because Boba is an aggression leader. You're going to naturally have access to all of these. The Devastator we've talked about a lot. Is the biggest card in there. IG-2000 is wonderful because it comes out, does 3 direct damage of my choosing, or up to 3 direct damage of my choosing, but all of that non-combat. The Jump to Lightspeed Fett's Fire Spray does 2 indirect non-combat damage. The War Juggernaut, shoot everything on the table. Non-combat damage. Daring Raid or other similar events that deal direct damage. Non-combat damage. And then I really like Allegiant General Pride in here. I feel like he is able to provide a lot of pressure. We'll talk about him a little bit more later on. Fett's Fire Spray is also part of a combo that we will talk about later. Other considerations here, and some of these are things that you'll see on the sideboard. Some of them are things that you will see in the main deck. But other things that you can consider in this are events like Shootdown, which are good for direct damage. Darth Vader is a good one because if he is this is Darth Vader, the aggression, Jump to Lightspeed Darth Vader. As a pilot, he is dealing extra damage, and that is non-combat. I like Hotshot Maneuver. I have not squeezed it into a lot of things yet because I need some more on-attack abilities to be able to do that consistently. But Hotshot Maneuver is good because it does things outside of combat. Planetary Bombardment, we talked about some indirect damage. That's the biggest single shot indirect damage we can get. I also have in here a couple of things like the Hunting Aggressor is a great one to squeeze in if we have some deck space, because that is going to add to each instance of indirect damage. So every time that you deal indirect for every Hunting Aggressor that is on the table, you add 1. And keep in mind that the indirect damage from 1 instance of indirect damage. If we put the Devastator on the table, it deals 4 indirect. That all happens at once. That's 1 instance. And so Hunting Aggressor would add 1 to that. You would add a 5th. If we then triggered Boba, he does 1 as a separate instance. Add 1 because of a Hunting Aggressor. The same would be true of the OOM officer. Or, sorry, not the OOM officer, but the First Order Stormtrooper would be another great example of that, because he is dealing indirect damage. If he had a Hunting Aggressor, he would be able to deal another one. And if he was defeated in an attack, he would then deal another indirect damage added onto by the Hunting Aggressor. I keep in my SWDB a set of toolboxes, and this is the Boba toolbox. In here, not all of them are what I put in core cards, but in here are a lot of things that are capable of doing either non-combat damage or indirect damage. And so these are super useful to kind of go back and look at when I'm trying to think of other ways that I can make this deck work. When I'm building and trying to kind of put things through, there are options in here if somewhere down the line we get a little bit cheaper of force units, or we get a little bit more consistent of force units, you could make a Boba Fett Jump to Lightspeed force deck that uses Fifth Brother and 7th Sister and the Fallen Lightsabers and other things like that to be able to use Force Throw and create direct damage off a Force Throw. So there's plenty of options in here. Not all of them are set in that toolbox. Wild Rancor, something similar to that you'd be able to drop out for 6, deal 2 damage to everything on the ground. I did put Fett's Fire Spray in here, the new one. As I said, we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But this is just my pool of things that I look back to when I try and decide where can I go with this. And so I've set it here where you can kind of take a look at it as well. Let's talk about Cunning for a second. I feel like Cunning is the other real main color that we talk about when we are looking at this Boba Fett. The core cards that I have in Cunning are the ISB agent for his ability, because this is going to be an event-heavy deck. Most of the time, I'm going to be able to pay one, show you an event, and deal a non-combat damage. Zygerian Starhopper, I really like. I like both versions of Yellow Boba Fett, Disintegrator, and Feared Bounty Hunter. The Elite P-38 Starfighter, we know very well from Django what it does. The Guerrilla Soldier is a marvelous 3-drop in this deck. Then Bosk Deadly Stalker is one of my favorite ambush units with this deck because if you're able to stick around with him and you play an event following him, you're able to trigger Boba's ability very, very cleanly. Considerations in here included things like Greedo, just another good 1-drop, and you can maybe deal some non-combat damage with him. He's not a guarantee, but he is good for possibly taking out things that are on the ground. The Kimgola Heavy Fighter is a great exhaust tool. If you played this a little bit more Underworld heavy, McClunky, we know it very well. McClunky is a really good card. We talk about it a lot in the Cad Bane version of the, or in the Cad Bane deck that I've done a version of this for. Freelance Assassin is something to consider. You can put him down, and if you have extra resources that you weren't going to be able to deal with that turn, Freelance Assassin and pay 2, deal indirect damage. Torpedo Barrage, we'll talk about. The Super Heavy Ion Cannon, and then Radiant 7. I didn't go to Radiant 7 in the version of the deck that I've got right now, but it's a strong consideration for a sideboard just because it not only does indirect damage on its own, it is a good TDR target a turn early, and it gives me a shrink. So it gives me a reason, like it's a pressure point. A lot of the things that we do when we are creating decks and looking at things, I'm going to go ahead and click to the next slide. A lot of the things that we do when we are creating decks is that we want to create pressure points. We want to create spots where our opponent has to choose what they're doing and how, and with this, since we're dealing damage to units and base, Radiant 7 does a great job of forcing that pressure point of saying, do I take an extra damage to my base and keep a more powerful unit? Or do I soak some more of that damage onto my unit and lose some of its ability to fight back? This is that toolbox. In that toolbox, I also included the tempo tools. So No Good to Me Dead, Triple Dark Raid, Waylay, Sneak Attack, and Commandeer. And a lot of those are definitely a nod to the current and relative strength of Django. We'll see kind of how those go, especially as the meta evolves, and especially if we see any kind of modification to that meta based on any type of restrictions. So I combined Command and Vigilance onto one slide, and I combined their toolbox into one toolbox because they are very limited. What Command gives me, even though I didn't put it in the toolbox, is access to ramp. We know really well what that is. And getting this Boba Fett out ahead is something that I tried in the very earliest iteration of this deck. Back when the Boba Leader, because he was released very early, back when we first got Planetary Bombardment, I looked at this and tried to figure out how early can I get a capital ship onto the board and do Planetary Bombardment. And the way that I was doing that at the time was with Outlaw Corona and Ramp and trying to get to that 6 resource turn the same time that you were getting to 5. Piet does it better. Just across the board, Piet does it better. And since you're talking about green-red, hey, look, I did a really big deep dive. Take a look at that one. If you want to do that and you want to ramp, use Piet. Overwhelming Barrage, Strike 2, Dorian Gunship, Air Superiority, Turbo Laser Salvo, Lightspeed Assault, all great. They all work, but it's a very limited box because that's pretty much it. Vigilance. Vigilance is more focused on healing than it is on damage. There are a few cards that work very well with it. There are a few cards that work very poorly with it. But these are the only cards that you have that are able to drop down and then consistently do what I expect them to do. Dr. Pershing takes a turn. He lets me draw a card. He forces me to do damage to one of my units. But in doing so, I did non-combat damage, and I can trigger Bo's ability. First Light is one that is nice to be able to pull out of your resource row. You deal 4 damage to another of your units. You did non-combat damage, but now everything you have has grit. But you see that this is a much more limited pool combined, and this is basically it. This is that whole set. The one good trick you have in here is salvage, being able to grab one of your things and put damage on it. You still have to pay for the ship, and you pay full price as opposed to what you do with Triple Dark Raid, but it's a nice little thing to be able to grab back. Might be a trick that I try if I am playing Twin Suns, but other than that, I don't. This is just not colors that we're going to go with. So that said, Cunning or Aggression. And those are the two decks that we're going to build out and talk about from the rest of this, from here to the rest of this presentation video. Card pool and Vigilance Command is just small. We're going to play Cunning or Aggression. Cunning gives us a larger overall pool because it adds color. It gives us tempo effects. It gives us bounce effects. It gives us some of our cleanest counters to things into Django. Until there's a change to the meta, I'm going to play Cunning if I'm playing Boba. But we'll talk about both of them because I think that there is space for double red, and there's some real power plays that can be had there. Yellow is a little bit able to recover from card draw. The tempo effects, the other things like that, you can slow the game down, you can speed the game up, you can do a lot of things with this that red just doesn't do because red just keeps trying to pump damage. It has the biggest possible combination when we talk about Triple Dark Raid into Devastator, which you can do on the Boba flip turn. And I did some of the math there saying that like if you're running it and you just have that combo and it's just the way that you do it, put out the Devastator, do four indirect damage that you are now in charge of, trigger Boba, do an extra one, flip Boba into the Devastator, deal 4 as barrage, swing for 13. You can do up to 18 damage to the base and 4 to the board in just 3 actions. And it's real hard to recover from a 22 damage swing to the board. And that's what Devastator offers you in this. And if you do it that way, you're going to put Boba back at the end of your turn as a ready to do his trick again, ready to deal indirect damage leader. It might not be the cleanest thing that you do, but it definitely can catch you back up in games or just win you a game outright. Aggression gives us double aspect. It gives us some really powerful plays, but it loses those tempo tricks. It is more linear. It is less combination focused. You do have in there one of the least fair things that you can do, which is to say that you drop a Relentless Fire Spray and you put Boba in it. And if you do that on his 6 resource turn and claim, you deal the barrage damage, you claim, and you've got an 8-10 in space that is going to swing and then ready itself. So you can represent 16 damage. It's kind of telegraphed. You know exactly where it's going. You know exactly how it's going to operate. But it is a really, really strong play that you can make that is more or less exclusive to the red deck. All right. This is the list that I am currently working with Boba Yellow. You can see in here that I've got ISB Agent and Allegiant General Pride, Crafty Smuggler, Zagirian Starhopper as my early game package. I have some events in here for early game, including Shootdown and Daring Raid. My 3 drops, I've got 4 different options for. I've got Boba Fett and Guerrilla Soldier on the ground. I've got Droid Missile Platform and Elite P-38 in the air. And I also have Torpedo Barrage or Triple Dark Raid available to me at that time. Dengar as a pilot is available to me at that time. So I have a big, big suite of things that I can play turn 2. Turn 3, the 4 resource turn, I've got a natural drop for IG-2000. I've got Fett's Fire Spray. I can do 2 of the top pair. I can do a lot of different things in that one. The 5 resource turn, I've got Boba Fett over here that I could put on the ground if I need to. I can do a lot of different things with Triple Dark Raid, bringing me in either War Juggernaut or a Ruthless Raider. You could put Bosk in at this point. You could do a lot of different things with this. I want to show you just for a second a couple of things that are in the sideboard. The sideboard is not a complete sideboard. I left some interpretation for you in this. But there are a couple things that I want to talk about. Number 1, right here is the electromagnetic pulse, which is really good against space heavy meta. It's going to deal some non-combat damage and exhaust, and it's a one-cost event. I like shoot down a little bit better in most cases until we start talking about Django. And so if you're getting past turn 2, shoot down might become less effective and electromagnetic pulse might become more effective because you're starting to talk about dealing with things like Ruthless Raider, War Juggernaut, IG-2000, which have more health and are not going to blow through to get to that. They're not going to blow through to get the extra 2 damage to the base. Another one that we want to talk about here is Give Into Your Anger. This is a great one, especially in that 4 to 5 resource space. If you have something that you want their unit to attack into yours, your opponent has played a Falcon and droid missile platform is out there. Well, let's say that Quinlan is doing that, right? He pings the droid missile platform for 1. It's now a 1 health unit sitting there with 4 attack. Well, now I respond with Give Into Your Anger. I force the Falcon to attack into my droid missile platform. Droid missile platform does its when defeated trigger afterwards, so it does its 3 indirect damage after the Falcon has been defeated. And I can then add 1 to that. I can add 1 on either side of that with Boba, but sequencing matters. If I do that and I use Boba's ability when I play, what I wind up with is that I have played Give Into Your Anger. I've lost, essentially, the indirect damage from Boba because they can sink that into Falcon, and then they have to attack something. They knew the Falcon was going to go away, so they just absorbed as much of it as possible. So this is a big part of what we want to do and make sure that our sequencing in this deck is really the key to playing it well. You also have in here No Good to Me Dead and Force Choke, which Force Choke is your cleanest answer in most cases to things like Tech or DJ. So if Han is a bigger part of your meta, Force Choke is something you definitely want from the sideboard. No Good to Me Dead. I had a question about this versus In Debt to the Crimson Dawn. I prefer No Good to Me Dead because In Debt to the Crimson Dawn does not immediately exhaust whatever your target is. And so if we're talking about something that has been brought in by Triple Dark Raid and is going away at the end of the turn, No Good to Me Dead just stops it cold. You've burned whatever they've burned whatever resources, you've burned 2. Yeah, we haven't triggered Boba's ability with this, but we just stopped that play, and the only effect that it got was its when played trigger. A couple of card choices in here besides that. I did include Torpedo Barrage for right now. You will see that I don't have Planetary Bombardment in this. I prefer a clean 5 for 3 with the potential of making it a 6th off the Boba trigger to a conditional 12 for 6. And that 12 for 6 happening only if I have one of these 2 guys on the table, only if I have a Devastator or Ruthless Raider. Since I'm not really going way up on my resources past to get Devastator past getting Devastator as a natural play, I'm bringing it in as a Triple Dark Raid target. And so there's a much better chance that it's going to hit and vanish than there is that it's going to hit and stick. I'm going to wind up playing that from the sideboard if I play it at all. So let's talk about playing that deck. Turn 1. With initiative, I want to play General Pride. General Pride represents the largest single swing that I can have off of a turn 1 play because he is going to deal 2 indirect damage as long as I've got initiative. He also represents the ability for me to rip a shield from a unit. So if they play a Crafty Smuggler back into you, General Pride swings at the board. And if they take any of that 2 indirect, he rips the shield. Into a turn 1 play, I prefer ISB revealing an event. Or if it's a space unit and we're talking about a fighter, which we cover in the loop deck. Not a lot of fighters, especially the 2-drop fighters, have anything over 3 health. So shoot down is going to take out basically any of them, deal 2 damage to the base, and then deal the indirect damage. They've got nowhere else to put it. Daring Raid, and that sequencing matters. So Daring Raid is another option. We can deal that with an ISB agent and manage to deal some indirect and really kind of pop our opponent. Indirect damage from Boba, direct damage from Daring Raid. We have the ability as well to play that Daring Raid first and just claim immediately. Other safe plays here include the Crafty Smuggler and Zygerian Starhopper, where if you got both of them, you can kind of lane dodge your opponents if you choose to. Turn 2. Into a clean board or less than 3 total health. My preference is to play Guerrilla Soldier. I want him out there, and my opponent gets to choose: do I kill off my turn 1 play, or do I take some of this damage to my base? And if I do, Guerrilla Soldier's readied. Otherwise, you can consider Boba Fett, or you can consider any of your 3-cost space drops. If you have played Zygerian Starhopper turn 1, Dengar as a pilot into Starhopper, if you're not expecting a lot of space contest, or if you're not expecting a whole lot of pilot removal, is another great option, because this is a good way for you to start pouring on some indirect. Bridging to the Boba flip. We've got a 6-cost leader. Most of our opponents are going to play their leaders at least 1, if not 2 turns earlier than us. Piet's gonna play at least 2 turns earlier than you if he does what he's supposed to. Kazuda is going to play 2 turns earlier than you naturally. Han can play a couple of turns earlier than you can. And then Django is going to play 1 turn before you. So bridging to the Boba flip is important, and we have to think about how we're going to get between that 3-resource turn and then the 6-resource turn, where all of the other leaders that are likely to see play at this point are going to be put into play. We can use ships to our advantage. We're not deeper in space than Django is, but we have better ways to apply pressure than he does, because Django is not typically going to run things like the droid missile platform because it doesn't ping for him. We want to keep that board small. We want to keep our opponent's effective health includes the things that are on the board for them. So we want to keep that board small and keep applying pressure where that indirect damage has to be soaked to base, if possible. One of our best cases is that we can use something like Triple Dark Raid. On 5 resources, one of my favorite plays in this deck is to run Triple Dark Raid on 5 if I have Jump to Lightspeed in hand. And the reason why I have Jump to Lightspeed in the deck at all is for Fett's Fire Spray. It works as well on Devastator and can do it in a kind of nasty way later on. But with Fett's Fire Spray and Triple Dark Raid covers the entire cost. So at 5 resources, if I don't have that Fire Spray in hand, go searching for it, play it. It's on attack, does 2. I can, if it's the right point in sequence, I can use Boba at that point and add another one. When I attack with it, it's going to deal 2 indirect damage. It's going to deal 4 damage, and hopefully I can get that to base. If it survives that round or survives to my next action, I can play Jump to Lightspeed on it, and now that's going to pull it back to my hand, but allow me to replay it for free using its trigger again. So for a 3rd time in this turn, I'm going to deal 2 indirect damage off of playing Fett's Fire Spray. And so that's a really big swing, because at one point in there you can add. So I've done 7 off of indirect, and I've done 4 damage off of the swing. And so even if my opponent plays no good to me dead on it, they don't want it, they don't want it swinging. Great, that's perfectly fine. I want it ready for Boba the next round. Play Jump to Lightspeed on it. I still get away with getting 4 to 5 indirect out of it, and have it ready instead of having it exhausted for this turn and next. So that's a really interesting play that you can make, and the reason why Jump to Lightspeed is in here. It's one of the first things that I wind up cutting when I go sideboarding. But it's a great combo early on. In game, we already talked about Devastator is the most powerful play that you can have. If you need to catch up something right now and you need to put it, you can put a game away that is within 13. Or that's within. You can put a game away that's within 18 because Devastator is going to allow you to put indirect damage where you choose. And so you can put all 5 into the base, put Boba into the Devastator, and if they don't have a way to block it, swing for 13. So I can end a game that is within 18 on that turn. And so if you've managed to, on a 30-point base, if you've managed to get 12 into it, you can end the game on Boba's flip. All right, let's look at the red one. A little more linear, a little less event or a little bit more event heavy, but we're using them tactically in a slightly different way. We also have Tarkin Town on this one because we want another way not only to deal non-combat damage, but to clean up some units because our units don't want to bash into theirs nearly as much if possible. We do add that First Order Stormtrooper as a possibility for a turn 1. Allegiant General Pride is also he's still our best turn 1 option. We added the Kylo's TIE Silencer here. We added the TIE Bomber. And the reason we added the TIE Bomber here is for it to just stack on the indirect damage. It also makes a great target for this Darth Vader unit here to go into as a pilot because he is going to deal damage outside of combat with his on attack ability and trigger Boba. And then you also have 3 indirect damage that's coming on attack. This is a great place if you wanted to look at hotshot maneuver because you've created a vehicle out there with 2 different on-attack abilities and a 3/7 that's going to be hard to contend with. And so if it does 2 on-attacks and then Vader gets to ping something and then it does 3 indirect and 3 for its strength, you really have something that kind of keeps space very clean. And so that is a strong consideration for something that could go in here. We still have the Fett's Fire Spray. We put Hunting Aggressor in here as well, though it's one of the things that I would consider dropping from this deck. Aggression comes in here as both a rip for upgrades and dealing some direct damage. It can also buy you some card draw. 6 is a little crowded if you put Darth Vader on the ground, but both of our 6 cost things are good. We're going to get more out of Ruthless Raider in the 6 resource turn than we are the Relentless Fire Spray. However, getting that Fire Spray up and ready, and then especially if we can stick Boba Fett into it, is a real power play because, as we've said, this is going to make it an 8/10 unit that readies on attack. And so that's kind of one of our big closers here as opposed to what's going on with the other one. It's more event heavy, doesn't have access to TDR. You prefer units which deal non-combat damage over those which do not. So when you're playing cards and you're trying to figure out what goes in, if it's between Hunting Aggressor and IG-2000, I'm picking IG-2000 in almost every case. Get Hunting Aggressor into place if you have a couple of things out there that can deal non-combat damage, especially if they deal indirect damage. And utilize that damage and sequencing wisely, because what you don't want to do is that you don't want to force choke something that has 2 health left, unless it is something that you absolutely must remove. A lot of your indirect damage is going to be wasted into units if you sequence your turns poorly. And so making sure that you use some of your events in ways that they clear units off the board so that your indirect damage has to go to base is the best way to do this. Or use your event, and while things are clear, that would be the time to use Boba Fett. All right, matchups. The Milan sector, 25% was Django. And that's data that we had early on. The top tables were huge Django versus Django matchups. His units are a little bit lower on health on average than some of their resource rate counterparts. So what I mean by this is that if I am looking at a elite P-38 starfighter versus Millennium Falcon, I've got a 3-2 versus a 3-4. So on rate, he's got 2 less health in there. Making sure that you sequence your actions in a way that lower the effective health pool so that most of your indirect damage has to be soaked to base is how we get through Django. And he's got some of our same in-game tricks. And so know that we have the ability with our leader to really pop some things, but I've discussed this in another video about beating the meta decks. Django's a kill on sight. We have to get him off the board where he cannot exhaust our big units at the end of the game in order to make our big swing. Quinlan Voss. Quinlan is a third as popular in what we've seen so far as Django, but is one of the more prominent decks besides Django Fett in this early meta. He's a difficult match because of his hand disruption, and we just have to think about when we're resourcing certain things. And so Quinlan's first couple of turns, his ability to do things like jam communications will rip events. And so if we have an opening hand that is very event heavy, we might consider mulliganing to something that is less event heavy, and even going ahead and placing some of our events in the resource row rather than holding on to them so that jam communications is a one resource whiff. We might consider holding events on the 4 resource turn, because if we discard an event, Ahsoka does not exhaust one of our units. He is weaker in space than we are in either of these versions, and takes a lot of actions to deplete base health. Quinlan's average across his units is that his units average doing about 3 per swing. So he's going to take 9 actions to take down Tarkin Town. He's going to take 10 actions to take down a 30 health base. And so you're really, as long as you can mitigate some of those actions, you can get to your end game play and you can really blast him. He might be ahead for a little while, but if you get to your 6 resource turn and you're able to sequence things correctly and you're not purely top decking, you can be okay in this matchup. Han is slightly stronger in space than Quinlan is. He's got better ground units than Quinlan does. Make sure that you're using your removal in ways that don't waste damage into this match, because he's got a lot of ways that he can just soak up some of your indirect and kind of ignore it, especially if his ground presence is not challenged. You're definitely going to bring in Force Choke, and you might consider having 3 Force Chokes in your sideboard for this matchup if it's a big part of your meta, and hold on to it for Tech or DJ. Be aware that Bodhi can take it from you, and so if you got 2 in your opening hand, don't resource 1, because Bodhi will take 1 and wind up just sad. Units like Droid Missile Platform are great for eliminating Falcon while still doing indirect damage, because that indirect damage happens when they're defeated. He's bigger than your early game space units. He is not bigger than your late game space units, because he doesn't really pile on large units in space. He just has better ones with things like the transports. All right. That is it for this round. I hope you enjoy playing around with Boba Fett and getting an opportunity to play with this new leader. He's a lot of fun to deal with. I have won a couple of sealed events with him just because that was what I wound up playing. And he's really interesting when he gets the opportunity to do what his leader ability is. But definitely in a good place as far as going into this meta with Django. He's in a decent place to combat Quinlan, Han Solo. I feel like he's at a disadvantage into Piet, because Piet's, and I didn't include Piet on here because Piet's ships are just big. Piet's going to be a struggle because he's bigger in space than we are. and his units are just soak and soak and soak damage. So we're going to have a real struggle into Piet. Your best strategy there, if you're at a big event, is to dodge him, but that's not necessarily up to you. Anyway, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.